think we are ready to start. My name is Frances, and I'm the head of the EU delegation here, and I'm very delighted to have you around this table this afternoon, together with Joergen Oerstroem, who's probably one of the most experienced Danish diplomats and who have been living in the region in Singapore for now 16 years. Before that, he was State Secretary in the Danish Foreign Service, going through some of the difficult parts of the negotiations between Denmark and the European Union in the 90s. He's also a famous writer, and you'll see that out on the table outside the room you have two of his newest books. It must be the two newest: Global Economy and Transition from last year, and Asia Can Shape the World. Today's lecture, just so you're aware of it, will be video recorded, and we will put the video feed on our website afterwards, so that the discussion today and the presentation by Oerstroem will be seen not only by us here, heard by us here, but also by a wider audience here in Vietnam. For the Vietnamese friends, I think we have the overheads in Vietnamese that have been copied for you. I hope you have received that one. And we also have an interpreter here. If there are parts of the discussion that you feel that you don't understand, just interrupt, and we can get interpretation, or we can get the interpreters to sit close to those who may wish to have interpretation. So, Jan, the word is you. You have about an hour and 20 minutes. And I would, it depends on you, but I would suggest maybe that we take the presentation first, but that you come with questions quite quickly into the presentation. And I think also Jörgen is so experienced that he is very comfortable in taking questions as he moves on. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity to come here today and talk about the global economy and European perspective. I'm very happy for the initiative, and I'm grateful for meeting a Vietnamese audience and have the honor of discussing these very important things with you. First, I'm going to look a bit on Europe. How does Europe, the Eurozone, the European economy look? After that, we look forward to year 2050, a very long view. After that, we will look for why I make the proposals I do, the transition of the global economy. We will not any longer mass consume, but we will mass communicate, and we will not any longer have abundance of commodities. We will live in a world of scarcities, which is not so. That will produce a new economic model, and we'll see how Southeast Asia stands facing with these problems. Now, we have all heard about the euro crisis, and to a very large degree, there actually never was a euro crisis. What we have seen over the last 7-8 years is a global debt crisis, namely that a number of rich countries have borrowed more than they should, and they have spent more than they actually produced. It was a completely reckless behavior, and they should not have been allowed to do so. Of course, if over many years you spend more than you earn, you get difficulties. It all started in the US on Wall Street, and we saw the effect on the Eurozone. One of the reasons for that is that there may have been too high expectations when we created the Euro. We wanted and we saw the Euro as a currency that could bring a phenomenal economic growth, which it actually did for some years, but it could not continue to do so. I was among those who negotiated were aware that there were flaws and shortcomings, but we thought that along the road we would be able to bridge the gap. And this is actually also what has been done. Over, let's say, 7-8 years, the Eurozone has gone through a very difficult period. But while, let's say, 2 or 3 years ago, you couldn't open a newspaper without being told that the euro would break up the next day. Nowadays, the consensus is that the euro and the Eurozone crisis have managed to come through the crisis and have created a sound basis for economic growth. So the crisis you have heard about has certainly been overblown. I have no doubt that not only will the Eurozone survive, but out of this will come a much stronger, a much sounder, a much more robust Eurozone and a stronger euro as a global currency. But it will be a different European Union we will see as a result of what has happened over the years. Now, if we look at some of the things we hear about the Eurozone, you read in the newspaper about the phenomenally high unemployment in Europe. The plain fact, compared to the US, which is the correct comparison, so to speak, is that the euro area has created 600,000 more jobs than the US since 1999. And the reason that the unemployment rate in the Eurozone is higher than in the US is that all those people looking for a job in the US have actually left the labor market. If you say that the number of people looking for a job is the same today as in year 2000, the unemployment rate in the US would not be 6 point something, but it would be 12%. And the unemployment rate in the Eurozone would not be 12%, but it would be 9%. So even if you read in the newspaper that the unemployment is much worse in the Eurozone than in the US, the plain fact is that it is actually better among the Eurozone countries than in the US. The second thing is that when you look at the balance of payments of the weak countries, you know, the countries in the Eurozone being hit, so to speak, by the crisis, first of all Greece, then Portugal, Spain, Ireland, and Italy. They have actually managed to turn their current account of balance of payments around. Look at the figures in 2008, and there you can see that Greece had a deficit of around 16% of GDP, Portugal about 13%, Spain about 10%, Ireland about 7%, and Italy about 3-4%. After 4 years, at the end of 2012-2013, all of these 5 countries are actually running a surplus on their current account. And you know, as economists, that the first condition for having a sound economy is that you do not buy more from abroad than you sell. And this figure actually illustrates very clearly that the policies put in order by the Eurozone to tackle the crisis have been successful. I have not shown the similar curve for the United States, but if you did, you would see that the United States is running a deficit on the current account more or less in the same magnitude as was the case in 2008, 2009. If you look at Britain, who is not a member of the Eurozone, you will see that Britain in 2008 had a set deficit on the current account of 2%. In year 2013, it had a deficit of 3%. So while the surplus on the current account for the Eurozone has gone up, while the weak Eurozone countries have managed to turn the balance of payments around, Britain outside the Eurozone has actually faced a deeper worsening of the situation on the balance of payments. So the policies work. What the Eurozone countries are doing is actually the right way to tackle the crisis. The results show very clearly that first, employment, second, balance of payments. If you look at the countries, the weak countries, Ireland got a commitment on the Eurozone, what we call a bailout program, meaning that the Eurozone will come and support you and give you money to solve the problem. Last year, Ireland finished that program, said we don't need it anymore, we are okay on our own. In the next month or two, Portugal, who got a similar program, will come and say the same. So two major countries in the Eurozone having a program to help them, saying, now we are okay, we don't need the support and help anymore. The banks, some years ago, they got substantial support from the European Central Bank. The European Central Bank actually lent them big amounts of money. What has happened is that many of these banks are now saying we don't need that support any longer. Even some of the banks, for example, one of the biggest European banks, the Italian bank Intesa San Paolo, at the end of January, only a couple of weeks ago, reimbursed 36 billion euros they had got in cheap loans from the European Central Bank. Again saying, like Portugal, like Ireland, thank you very much, you helped us, we are grateful for that, we don't need the money anymore. One more clear statistical evidence. Unemployment is falling now in Ireland, in Portugal, and in Spain. If we look at the growth prospects, if you see what the International Monetary Fund is saying, the International Monetary Fund is saying that for the year 2014, growth in the Eurozone will be 1%. I will guarantee you it will be higher. It will be something between 1 and 1.5%, maybe 1.2, even 1.3%. That may not be very much if you look at it from Vietnam's perspective, used to 5-6% growth. But for Europe, a mature economy, an established economy with a growth rate of 1-1.5% after having gone through a debt crisis, that is really a substantial achievement. The trend growth for the Eurozone is estimated to around 1.7%, which means that we are actually approaching to be close to the trend growth. What about debt? Sovereign debt means the government debt. And for the first time in 5 years, we saw that the government debt measured to gross domestic product fell in the third quarter of 2013. In the second quarter, it was 93.4% of GDP. In the third quarter, it was 92.7%. Compared to the United States, where you can see that the debt ratio is going up, going up, going up, going up. So while the Europeans have managed to get better employment, better current account balance payments, they have also managed now to start reforms are being undertaken in all countries. And I don't know whether I'm sorry to say so, but reforms means that you're going to work harder and you're going to work longer. And it says a lot for the Europeans that the European populations do not like that really, but they accept it and they actually do it. Europe is now the only country or group of countries in the world that is trying successfully so far to combine a welfare society with a competitive economy. A phenomenal achievement. We are still preserving the welfare state while we are making ourselves more competitive. No other country has managed that. Now, if we jump ahead and look to 2050, I like to look to 2050 because in 2050 I will be dead. So if I'm wrong, no one will come and help me accountable for what I'm saying now. If you make a shorter time horizon, there's always a risk that somebody will find out and say you were wrong. So I say 2050, and then I can die peacefully somewhere along the road. Now, in 2050, China and Southeast Asia will be the global winners. They will be the one with the strongest growth and the best economy in the world, provided that they manage to cope with the problems they have. And the most important of these problems is actually they need good governance. The Eurozone, not the EU, because that's not any longer what is so essential, but the Eurozone will do well, but will not be very dynamic. But it's okay with a growth rate of 1.5%. If you are already rich, which Europe is, and if you have a stagnant population, 1.5% growth is actually good. Africa will be the big positive surprise. US will be okay, but not more. Japan will be off the radar screen primarily because of demographics. In year 2100, there will only be 47 million Japanese left. Latin America will still bottom through. The losers will be Russia and the Middle East. And the danger point with inequality, pressure, demography, population will be South Asia. So let's have a look and see how we get there. First of all, we have our old friend, the debt. What you see now is two models for tackling the debt problem. The one is the European one, where you take the pain now, you go through austerity, you bring down the debt, which means that you make a solid basis for a recovery and a growth. It's very painful now, but when you have gone through the tunnel, you're actually in a better position. Now, the American model is that you spend what the Chinese will lend you. And you read time after time in the newspapers that the Americans have agreed to solve the debt crisis, their own debt crisis. When the Americans solve the debt crisis, the only thing they do is that they agree among themselves to go on borrowing more from the Chinese, which actually means that the Americans are postponing the moment where they will have to bring spending into line with what they earn, which actually means that 3 years, 5 years, 10 years from now, the United States economy will be in a very, very difficult state. In Southeast Asia, the problem is that you have a high degree of corporate debt, which we actually have to tackle. One thing that worries me deeply is two things, primarily the US, but also in Japan. The first thing is that because of the heavy borrowing, the net interest payments are very, very high. Already now, they account for around 1.4% of GDP in the US. That is around 8% of the government budget in the US. 10 years from now, calculated by the Congressional Budget Office, it will be somewhere between 3.2 and 3.4% of GDP. And that corresponds to 20% of the government budget in the US. Just imagine it, 20% of what the US government gets in taxes will have to be paid back interest on what the US have borrowed. It's very, very difficult to see where you can find the money from. The second thing is what is called age-related spending. If you make a calculation to 2040, saying that you need what is defined as a sound fiscal position, sound government finances, Japan needs to do a fiscal contraction of 19%, 19% of GDP. The US needs to do approximately 16% of GDP, which actually means that both Japan and the US faces a very acrimonious fiscal position where they need to do a lot to make government finances in a state where they can finance the country. So I expect Japan first to face an extremely difficult, acrimonious fiscal situation, and later the US. I will even go so far to say that I think there's a risk that the United States of America can default, in the sense that they cannot pay back what they have borrowed, and they cannot pay net interest payments. And therefore, I'm optimistic with regard to Europe, because the Europeans have taken the pain now, the austerity now, when it was manageable. The US is postponing it and trying to do it at a later stage when it will not any longer be manageable. Now, if we look at the demography, it's very interesting to see the different patterns in Asia. The Chinese labor force will stop to rise next year. After that, it will start to fall. And you all know that when the labor force goes down, labor-intensive manufacturing, competing on cost basis, will move out of that country, which actually means that labor-intensive manufacturing will move from China to other countries. Some of these countries will be found in Southeast Asia. One of these countries is Vietnam. Another one is Indonesia. The Philippines maybe also. Myanmar maybe also. That means that the Chinese will have to shift their competitive parameter to focus more on research and development. They're already trying to do so. What it means is that we will see a complete change in production pattern in East Asia, with China doing less manufacturing, other countries, including Vietnam, doing more manufacturing. A very interesting change taking place, and how it will be managed will be decisive for the future of the Southeast Asia. It also has a lot of repercussions on consumption, because old people, they consume differently from young people. And that is one of the reasons that Japan will get into difficulties, because there are not so many young people anymore. That's also one of the reasons that China will face difficulties. It will first be in year 2030, 2035, when the young people will continue to be fewer in China. But what what we will see in China with the big mass of consumers is more single persons, smaller families, more women, and because the population gets older, more welfare, more healthcare, more pharmaceutical products. So a total change in consumption. India, South Asia will benefit from that because there you will have a rising population taking over some of the labor-intensive manufacturing and still have a young population for consumption. Southeast Asia is divided. Vietnam, the Philippines, Indonesia, Myanmar will until around 2050 have a rising population, while some of the other countries will have a falling population. But Vietnam falls into the category where you will have a positive, encouraging demographic picture with young people, dynamic, having good skills, being able to move into manufacturing to support the continued economic development of the country. One of the fascinating things of this is urbanization, because we can see that the overwhelming part of economics, technology, innovation, dynamism takes place in cities. And we can see in China, also in India, but primarily in China, we can see that in 1975, only 17% of the Chinese live in cities. In 2020, it will be 800 million. Approximately 60% of the Chinese population will live in cities. Which means that we will see two things. For the firstly, we will see that cities itself, mega cities, mega regions, as a big, solid economic concentrations will drive economic growth. The second thing we will see is that China will continue to have growth in the next, let's say, 10, 15 years, because if you urbanize, if you move people into cities, you need infrastructure, you need housing, you need roads, you need bridges, you need railroads, etc. So investment infrastructure will continue to boost the Chinese economy with a very high growth rate. So I'm absolutely certain that for the next 10 years, the biggest growth machine in the world globally will be the urbanization of China with infrastructure and investment. It will be less so in India because only 41% will live in cities in year 2020, but it will still be significant. Therefore, we can see that the big cities, the mega regions will be trendsetters. If you look back over the last 150 years, you will see that all the new trends, all the new consumption, all the new ideas, they came from the big cities. Paris, Berlin in Germany, London in Britain, New York, Los Angeles. Now, what happens is that big cities, the mega cities, will be in Asia, which means that the trends will emerge in Asia, not any longer in Europe or in the United States. The Chinese cities, Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, Vietnam, Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh City, Jakarta maybe, Bangkok maybe, Mumbai, Chennai, New Delhi, all these big concentrations of purchasing power, technology, ideas, innovations, people will actually define what kind of consumption you're going to have in the next 20 or 30 years. Not only that, you will have middle-sized cities. If you for example, look at Asia from a European perspective, if you are a manager of a European company, you may say that, look, a city of 30 million people, like the one we have, for example, in Chongqing in China, is too big for me. I would try to do it with a medium-sized city of about 2 or 4 million people. There are a lot of them where you can go in and test the water to see whether you can actually sell your product. And you can also test the countryside. So basically, the mega cities and the mega regions, which we will see in Asia, will drive the global economy in many years. You can see here a picture of where they are. Tokyo, Delhi, close in Asia. Shanghai, Asia. Mumbai in Asia. Beijing, Asia. Dhaka, Asia. Calcutta, Karachi, Manila, Osaka, Guangzhou, Shenzhen, Chongqing, Jakarta, Seoul, Wuhan, all of them will actually put their mark on the economic development. Now, this looks very perplexing, but I'll try to summarize it in a very few words. This figure shows two things. Who are the global leaders in innovation and who are efficient in innovation. The global leaders in innovation, the US, Canada, European countries, Israel, Singapore, Hong Kong, we know them all. It's not so interesting. It's more interesting when we look at Asia to look at what is called the learners. Look there. We have Malaysia, we have China, we have India, we have Vietnam, and we also have very close to that Indonesia. Now I'll tell you something if we jump to what is called efficient innovators. When you innovate, you need money. And those who make this analysis, they try to find out who get most innovations for less money. When you pour in $10 million, how much innovation do we actually get out of it? Those who were above the average were labeled efficient innovators, and those who were below were mentioned inefficient innovators. Now, number 6 of global efficient innovators is Indonesia. Number 11 is India. Number 14 is China. All of them in Asia. And you can see here, Vietnam is quite close to India among the learners. And Vietnam is actually classified as an efficient innovator. If you are among the learners, and if you are classified as an efficient innovator, it means that you actually face a bright future as far as innovation is concerned. This figure is therefore actually very encouraging for Asia, East Asia in particular. The only country it's not encouraging for is actually Japan and Korea, and to a certain degree also Hong Kong. Japan is classified as an inefficient innovator, and Korea the same, even if they are among the leaders. But this figure tells us who will actually be the leaders 25 years from now. And for us sitting here today, China, India, Vietnam, Indonesia will be among the leaders 25 years from now. Very interesting perspective made by 3 independent institutions, all of them not connected to East Asia, so there's been no automatic bias from it. One more thing, the supply chain. You know the supply chain, how you actually produce goods that are used as components. The global supply chain does not exist anymore. now we are starting to see a more compact supply chain among countries close to each other. You see it in Vietnam. China is now outsourcing to Vietnam. Next thing may be India. Next thing again may be Africa. But the supply chain is becoming compact because transport costs cannot any longer be ignored. Because it's good to be close to the customers. And one more thing, 10, 20 years ago, you produced in China because it was cheap, and you exported to the US with a big market. Now China has grown so rich that China has become an important market in itself. So you now produce in China to start to sell to the Chinese market, which actually means that you are not so interested anymore in transporting it to the US. So the fact that Southeast Asia is situated geographically close to the major markets in 2050. 2050, China will by far be the most important market. Already now, we know China is the second biggest global economy. Around 2025, 2030, about that, China will probably be the biggest economy. In 2050, it's almost certain that China will be number 1, and India will be number 2, and Southeast Asia, situated geographically so that it can plug into these two big markets in a more compact supply chain, will be able to reap very big benefits out of this situation. Now, energy and oil, if we look at it from a Southeast Asian perspective, problems. Southeast Asia used to be exporter of oil, and also, of course, being self-sufficient in oil. Now, that is not any longer the case. Net importer of oil, net importer of gas, and you know what? Net exporter of coal, and using a lot of coal for its own energy supply. What does that mean? It means that Southeast Asia is facing an increasingly important negative pollution effect. On top of that, Southeast Asia has not built what we call an energy grid, so that you can swap electricity among various countries, again meaning that energy supply is inefficient. Look at this one again, very perplexing. This is where you are going to find shale gas and oil. We find it in the US, in Europe, in China, also some other points of Southeast Asia. We find it in North Africa, and we find it in India. This means that for the first time since the age of oil, we find the energy supply where we have the demand. US, Europe, China, India. The only place still not having energy is Japan. This means that transport of oil will be less important in the future. The big transport from the Middle East, from Australia, from South America to the US, to Europe, will not any longer be there. We will gradually get the supply to pipelines inside our own countries. That means that China will also gradually start to become self-sufficient with energy. It also means one more thing, and that is, it is not certain any longer that the oil price will be high. We don't United States may not any longer be so interested as it used to be in having a low oil price, which actually occurs a fundamental shift in geopolitics. So shale gas and oil will have a major economic impact, giving a competitive advantage short-term for the US, but also changing the US perspective of what the oil price should be and how US will behave internationally. All this happens at the same time when we face a transition which can be compared to the Industrial Revolution 250 years ago. First, we go from mass consumption to mass communication. Second, we go from the era of abundance, era of plenty, to the era of scarcities. Two new key concepts, knowledge and scarcities. Knowledge, I'm sure you have it in the same way as I have it, that if you have not communicated with somebody else over the last 37 minutes, you are close to a nervous breakdown. We communicate instead of consume, which means that consumption is becoming less materialistic, more communication, which again means that people move closer to groups and communities with common and shared values, which again means that they change the way they shop. We have, for example, coupon, we have e-commerce, we have many of these things fundamentally changing the attitude of the consumer. But the most important thing is that we have knowledge as a production factor. All those of you having read economics will see that knowledge is different. It can be used again and again. It can be used by many persons at the same time, and it actually enhances its productivity the more you use it. So we have a new production factor, while at the same time we change our behavior. We consume less, we communicate more. The next thing is that we have the scarcity. We have food scarcity, we have resource scarcities, we have energy scarcity, and we have water scarcity. And we also have clean environment. Some people are looking at China and they say that if, for example, China has 10% growth, almost half of that will need to be used to address the environmental problems created by that growth. All these scarcities are linked to each other. We cannot solve one of them without aggravating the situation in other sectors. If we want to grow more food, we need more water. There's already a shortage of water. How can we get more water? Desalinate. But to do that, we need more energy. And there's always already a shortage of energy. And if we use more coal, we will actually enhance the pollution. So we run around inside a box, so to speak, where regardless of how we try to solve these problems, we run into a wall. It's very, very difficult to do because we have not managed to see that we actually need to look at things differently. When I was your age, and I look at the students, and I wish I was that age again, I was taught at the University of Copenhagen that productivity is a question about how much more can one person produce per hour. Now, because of the scarcity of resources, productivity becomes a question of how much more output can we squeeze out of one unit of input. A completely different perspectives. We cannot any longer afford waste. we cannot any longer afford to throw away. Waste becomes precious because it can be used again, which means that we will have to look at the life cycle for a product. If you buy a new fridge, you will be told that it is more energy efficient, so you're actually doing something for the environment. But actually, to produce the fridge, you have used a lot of resources. I look around here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 12, around 25, 30 plastic bottles. I'm sorry to tell you, but studies indicate that to produce 1 bottle of water in a plastic bottle, you use 1,600 more resources than to go and use the tap water. Just imagine what it means for our societies. If you have one of these chips you put into the handphone or the cell phones or whatever it is, to produce 1 chip, you use resources 600 times the weight of the chip. We are now 7 billion people in the world. 2050 or something like that will be 9 billion. Just imagine with a global growth of around 4%, increasing the population from 7 billion to 9 billion, we are going on using resources like that. It cannot be done, simply speaking. Therefore, we need to look at the life cycle. We need to be aware of the total use of resources for a product. Not only how much it consumes for a limited time, but for the total life cycle of the product. Even more, we have to look at the product cycle, namely, how do we actually manage it to more and more and more move towards recycling, remanufacturing. Some of you may have read about 3D assembling, meaning that you produce by a computer putting things together. The interesting thing in that is not 3D assembling. The interesting thing in that is 3D disassembly, meaning that when the fridge, the car, the computer, whatever it is, has finished its active life, you disassemble it. Take the components out and use them again. The product cycle. A product never dies. If you look at this computer, now when it's finished, you throw it away. 10 years from now, it will be put into somewhere and it will be disassembled. All the components will be used again. Because waste will get a price. Today, waste is free. You do not pay for it. And you are not paid for it. 10 years from now, there will be a price on waste, meaning that it is affordable, profitable for you actually to allow the components to be used again. I will guarantee you one thing, and I will guarantee you that it will happen in 2050, where I will not be there to be held accountable. I will guarantee you that when you open the newspaper today, you will see advertisement after advertisement asking you, encouraging you to consume more. In 2050, the message will be to consume less because the resources will not be there. The only way to achieve it will be the life cycle and the product cycle, which actually will move us toward what I call the new model. And that is driven by mass communication and scarcities. It means that we put lower growth, the scarcities, new consumptions, mega cities, reshoring. So the production will take place geographically closer to where you have resources, geographically closer to where you have the market, to reduce transport costs. production and consumption will be steered by less and less materialistic. Consumer preferences will change towards communication. You will move, I think, 20, 30 years from now, you will have a society called no waste. In Denmark, where I come from, we are already introducing very elaborate schemes of how you dispose of waste. It's not any longer so in Denmark that waste you throw it away, but you go to a certain place or where there is, where there will be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 containers for different kind of waste. And you put the waste in these specific containers, which allow the waste to be used again. This is where we are moving. And to make that work, people will move together in groups instead of societies and nations. What about Southeast Asia and all this? Basically, I'm optimistic. Southeast Asia has a diversified economy, manufacturing, agriculture, commodities, high-tech services, everything is there. So Southeast Asia is the only region in the world where you can actually adjust and adapt to the business cycle, and you can make sure that you continue to produce more and have high growth. And I think that conflicts are unlikely in Southeast Asia. There's a good spirit among the nations, even if they may quarrel from time to time. ASEAN works as a confidence building, and we have an ASEAN economic community on its way. We can see here the intra-trade figures, and there we can see that intra-ASEAN trade is actually not so interesting. It goes up from 22.8% to 30% in 2020, which is of course nice and good, but not fantastic. If you compare it with the European Union, I think that our inter-trade is running at almost 2/3 of all trade. The last figure I saw was 64%. I don't know whether you had a more, but about that. So an inter-trade in ASEAN about 30% is actually very low. It means that there's not so much to reap and benefit from an internal market among the ASEAN countries. But you can see that if you add China, you get to 45%. If you add India, you get to 51%. And if you add Japan, you get to 59%. So if you actually look at intra-trade in Asia, you get not totally, but you get close to the European Union figure. So the future for Southeast Asia is to plug into an Asian supply chain, primarily an East Asian supply chain, where you can reap the benefits of comparative advantages. And you can also see that the most dramatic fall in trade is actually ASEAN's trade with the United States, falling from 20.1% to 8.1%. Now, what to look at? Infrastructure. I've already talked about that. If you're going to industrialize, you must have infrastructure. Energy, you need a web so that you can exchange electricity, and you need pipelines, you need to do a lot with the infrastructure. Waste, you need to realize that waste is becoming an asset. In some European countries, waste amounts to 7% of GDP. Those countries are rich, they may be able to afford it. Southeast Asia cannot. Look at economic integration. Manufacturing is too low in the region, and governance is not good enough. If you look at the governance figure, the Asian Development Bank has made a calculation or a study which shows that over the last couple of years, actually governance in Southeast Asia is not improving very much. Governance is actually in some areas and for some countries worsening instead of being improving. So one of the most important things is that you actually grasp and see that the picture is changing. Until a couple of years ago, the task for Southeast Asia was to manage economic growth. In the future, the challenge for Southeast Asia will be to create the conditions for economic growth. And to do that, you actually need to make good governance, good corporate governance, but good governance, so that there is a stable platform for transformation of the economies in line with what I have said here. So now I'm coming to the end of my little talk, and I thank you very much for the attention, and we have some time for questions, and if we are lucky, we may also get some answers. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jørgen. We have different groups here of people from different walks of life. We have students from the Diplomatic Academy. We have journalists. I think for the journalists there will also be a chance at the very end of the presentation to have direct interaction. We have Europeans, and we have a few colleagues, and we have ambassadors. So please, the word is from Nathan.
My name is Sophie, I'm from the EU Delegation. I was thinking, thank you very much for the presentation. I have a question regarding your core model. I think maybe it was your core model that you presented. And you mentioned that you expect lower consumption, lower waste. What do you think will be the driver for that new model? Would that be consumer preference? Would that be government policies or inflation?
I think there are two things that will promote the model. The one is very simple, that the price for resources, commodities will go up, which means that people cannot afford to consume so much in the future as they used to be. The second thing is that mass communication will replace mass consumption. When you communicate, you cannot consume at the same time. And consumption, the objective of consumption is to make people, should we say, happy, comfortable, at ease. And because I have lost faith completely in economics, I have started to study anthropology, psychology, sociology, brain research, and things like that. And the fact is that out of all these non-economic sciences are coming the message that people actually becomes happier by doing something with others and for others than by consuming, which should push people towards consuming less. And when you look at the figures, it's sometimes difficult to substantiate, but if you look at the figures, from the United States is coming very interesting statistics showing that the number of miles a car is driven is falling every year. The number of young Americans at the age of 20 having a driver's license is falling. If you go back around 25 years, I don't recall the exact percentage, but if you go back around 25 years, 90% of young Americans at the age of 20 had a driver's license. Today the corresponding figure is 70%, which actually means that they drive less. There may be many explanations for that, but one of them is certainly that they find the satisfaction by doing something else than driving.
Thank you.
private person, not as a diplomat here. I just wanted to mention maybe 3 factors. I wonder how you figure in your analysis of the prospects for Asia, which you say that are very good. You said that the idea of conflict in the region is unlikely, but then you see this dynamic in China with increasing militarism and nationalism. How can we predict the future? It's really hard. I think. Secondly, I wonder if you have any thoughts about the challenge of nepotism and how you think
challenge of what?
Nepotism and because you mentioned in the end of your presentation that the challenge of governance is something that the region has to solve for a particular country in the region, but there's no guarantee that it's easy to solve. It's really, in some countries it takes centuries to build a framework of governance that actually functions as this source of long-term dynamism. And so somehow you have not faced this challenge in the region that it seems quite severe. That to get a job you have to have colleagues or there's a lot of corruption and so on. More than corruption, it's kind of personal connections and so on. And thirdly, I wonder, because a lot of dynamism seems to come from this kind of culture of virtue, like in many countries, in the region especially, we see a lot of strong values and personal drive and so on, and yet, as we saw in some ways in the West, and we are seeing this in the region here too, that this kind of focus on the kind of on building the character in education or in just the family is influenced by this other notion of increasing selfishness. So what you are saying is that there's this movement towards selflessness because it's that's how people should behave. I think that some people look and and say, okay, the families are getting smaller in China. One child in a family, for instance, on average, or a bit more, and that this might actually turn people, make people more selfish and not less. So I was wondering, this education towards virtue might actually not be increasing in the region, but decreasing. Sorry, maybe last point I wasn't really explaining very clearly, but they have those three kind of challenges or ideas how we answer it.
Is that clear to the Vietnamese friends here? Or do we need interpretation?
Yeah, the first question about the conflicts in the region. Of course, the East Asia will be dominated by China. It cannot be differently. You can base your forecast on 2 things. The first is that you can look at how China has behaved over the last 2,000 years. And the second is that you can see what the Chinese leaders are doing now. And even if it may sound strange for the Vietnamese, China has no real tradition of empire building. I will not be a Mr. Wise guy about the Chinese psychology and so on, but to my mind, China is like the elder brother in an Asian family, that China asks for respect from the younger siblings, and if that is forthcoming, the family functions. And I think that so far, over the last, let's say, 20 years, I think the policy coming out from China can be interpreted in the way that so far China seems to be willing to share the benefits of economic growth with the rest of East Asia. The third point in this is that what to do about the resources in, for example, the South China Sea, how will China behave there? You know, as a European looking at it from far away, I would say that the plain fact is that these resources and islands, they are disputed territories. And I can only see them solved in a way through negotiations. I don't know whether China will be able and ready to do that in the long run. But I would say that is the only way to do it. So I'm still fairly optimistic that East Asia will experience a peaceful rise. And I cannot see, I mean, if you compare to Europe, many people compare the situation now to Europe 100 years ago. But I don't see that any East Asian nation actually threaten other East Asian nations' vital interests. You may have divergence of interest, you may quarrel, things like that, but not really about the vital questions. The second issue you raised is about nepotism, and that was what I touched upon at the end of my speech, namely good governance. Of course, many of the countries in Southeast Asia need a real strong improvement with nepotism, corruption, kickbacks, and whatever. You only need to read the statistics from the World Bank or from the Asian Development Bank, and there you can see the obvious problems. And you can only hope that these countries, the governments, and the people will realize that they need to do a strong effort. Whether it will be done or not, I don't know. But I think there I'm a bit optimistic that the rich of the countries are getting, the more aware they will actually be about this problem, and also the larger will be the scope for actually solving them. The last question about the population and education, if I understood you correctly, there's no doubt that, for example, the one-child policy in China will change let's say the way people behave. I myself think that the cornerstone, the basis for a well-functioning society is the family. And I don't want to criticize the United States, but doing it anyway, I would say that it's not a well-functioning society because the family does not exist there any longer. If you look at the share of young people with single mothers, it's very it's 40% or something like that, very high percentage. The same you can see in Britain. And so far again, it seems that the Asian societies are more aware of the value of the family. And I don't see the family breaking up in the Asian society, at least not as fast and as far as it has happened elsewhere. The big problem, primarily for China, is of course, what do you do with 100, 200, 300 million elderly people needing care when the young people say, we don't want to do it? The only way out of this is that they buy some knowledge about welfare system from Denmark and be ready to export it to them because they need to do it. And you can also see time after time after time, you can see newspapers reporting that China is now starting to build a social welfare system. And they will have to do that, and it will be extremely costly. And it is one of the reasons that I think China will continue to have a high savings rate, and because of that, a surplus on the current account.
I'm wondering on the Vietnamese side if you have scared everybody away by saying that there will be no consumer society in Vietnam in the years to come, where everybody is working towards that goal right now. So if there's a question from the Vietnamese side, please come with it now because we only have about 1 or 2 questions left.
seems that the Vietnamese are happy. It seems that the Vietnamese are happy with a lower consumption in the future.
I was thinking about the mobile phone and the communication society maybe, but yeah.
Just a small quick question. I'm Zan from the Czech newspaper. You're based in Singapore, but you didn't mention Singapore once in your presentation. Where will this country be? At least
Where would
until
Singapore be? You didn't mention it in your
2050.
I think Singapore will do very well because Singapore is a very small nation having managed to plug into the global economy, and it's close to Indonesia, 250, 260 million people with a dynamic economy, and Singapore is a transport hub. Singapore has understood the value of the hub concept. Transport hub, technology hub, health hub, education hub. I teach at Singapore Management University. My class is 45 students. Every class there will be 3 or 4 Vietnamese, 4 or 5 Chinese, 4 or 5 Indians, 3, 4 Indonesians. So they have actually managed to use, let's call it their small size, to turn the city state, as it is called, into a hub, which is a very ingenious policy. But that also means that Singapore is totally dependent on the global economy. I mean, you can speak about the Vietnamese economy, you can speak about an Indonesian economy, but it's very difficult to speak about a Singaporean economy because it's too small.
Thank you.
Đầu tiên thì liên quan đến cái hiệp định thương mại tự do FTA mà EU và Việt Nam đang ký kết với nhau, ông thì đâu là những cái lợi thế cũng như là khó khăn đối với Việt Nam và Việt Nam cần phải làm gì?
Firstly, relating to the FTA free trade agreement between Vietnam and EU, what do you think about the benefits and the challenge that Vietnam have to deal with in the future? This is the first question. We have 5.
Maybe we take all 5 in one go. We take all 5.
Và câu hỏi chung thôi, tức là ông có một vài cái đánh giá như nào về triển vọng kinh tế của Việt Nam cũng như là vai trò của Việt Nam trong khu vực ASEAN trong lĩnh vực kinh tế.
And what do you think about Vietnam's role and the Vietnam future in Southeast Asia area, the future?
Và cuối cùng thì ông có một cái lời khuyên cụ thể nào cho những cái doanh nghiệp của Việt Nam trong cái thời kinh tế của Việt Nam không?
And finally, could you please have some advice for Vietnamese enterprise in the new era of integration in economy? Thanks.
I think I'll ask the EU ambassador to answer the first question. Because speaking him and not me.
On the FTA, we have now had 7 rounds of negotiations, and we hope to conclude in October this year. I think the main benefit is one that the audiences often tend to overlook, but which the government is fully aware of here in Vietnam and also the EU authorities. And that is that the FTA is a way also to make developments internally in Vietnam and in the European Union by creating a more regular trading system, not only with foreign partners, but also domestically within the country. One example that links up to the presentation by Joergen Oerstroem is the example of the corruption. The word nepotism was used also. If we take the public procurement agreement under the WTO, public procurement is basically a way to create a transparent, effective system of government purchases. And that is a key part in our FTA negotiations. But if we succeed, and if we do sign up, Vietnam signs up to the public procurement agreement with the EU that we are negotiating, it means that the main benefits will fall to Vietnamese companies and to the Vietnamese economy here.
The second question about ASEAN and Vietnam, I can only say that I think Vietnam should play a very important role in ASEAN. If you look at Vietnam's size, population, and the economy, and the significance of Vietnam for ASEAN, I think it would be welcome with a stronger profile for Vietnam, and Vietnam would try to, let's call it, exploit the advantages ASEAN actually provides for Vietnam. And the third question about the Vietnamese companies, well, I'm not an expert on that, but I would imagine that being a country that is moving into manufacturing, you should be very much aware of the quality perspective, which means that when you deliver goods, it must live up to certain standards and quality standards. Otherwise, you risk losing out. It's not, Vietnam is certainly competitive on price and wages, certainly. I don't know whether Vietnam is also competitive on quality, but the quality is more difficult to achieve than the price competitiveness. So I say look out for making sure that the quality is always achieved.
I think we have to call it to a close now because I'd like the journalists present in the room to have a few minutes to interact directly with Pastor Müller. And I think also there are a couple of other people in the audience who would like to say hello before he has to go to the airport, which is in 10 minutes or so. So thank you very much. Thanks for coming out from Singapore, and we hope to see you very soon again here in Vietnam.
Thank you very much.